This podcast is produced by Gallico Studios, a multimedia effort supported by a community of activists who share the goal of exposing the pollution story behind public water fluoridation. To join the studio or learn more, visit our website at www.fpollution.com. That's the letter F, then pollution, all one word, .com. Welcome to the Fpollution podcast. I'm your host, Melissa Gallico, author of The Hidden Cause of Acne, How Toxic Water is Affecting Your Health and What You Can Do About It. And F is for Fluoride, a feasible fairy tale for free thinkers 15 and up. Season 1 of the Fpollution podcast exposes the pollution story behind artificial water fluoridation in the United States. First, we followed a paper trail which is available for anyone to see in the show notes at fpollution.com, showing how corporate polluters influence the science and public health officials to obscure the negative health effects of their fluoride air pollution. Then, we learned how the adverse health effects of fluoride seemingly got past all the big federal agencies like the EPA, the CDC, and the Surgeon General. We also launched a sidebar series called Stranger Than Strangelove to tell some of the more overlooked aspects of the American fluoride tragedy. The first episode in the series, Episode 6, focuses on a secret government fluoridation experiment at mental institutions for children in Massachusetts in the 1940s and 1950s. In today's episode, we'll continue our Stranger Than Strangelove series with the true story of how fluoride air pollution from 2 U.S. aluminum plants decimated the traditional economy of the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne, a Native American tribe bordering upstate New York and Ontario, Canada, and contributed to their community's devastating descent into civil war. In the Mohawk language, Akwesasne means where the partridge drums, because the sound of the rapids along the St. Lawrence River where the group is situated reminded the people of the sound a partridge makes with its wings on a log during mating season. But in the early 1900s, the rivers in Akwesasne suddenly grew a lot quieter when industry moved to town and built dams to produce hydroelectric power for the nearby factories. According to Frank Siemens, the lead fluoride litigator in the mid-1900s for the Aluminum Company of America, also known as Alcoa, prior to World War II, Alcoa never received any complaints about their fluoride air pollution, despite a lack of any type of pollution control devices, because they didn't put the factories in physical locations that would cause a lot of damage. Siemens wrote about this in a book we discussed in Episode 3. But back in 1903, downwind of the farmers and ranchers at Akwesasne, the Aluminum Company of America built what was to become the longest continually operating aluminum factory in the world. In 1958, Reynolds Metals built a second aluminum factory in the same region. As you might recall from previous episodes, due to fluoride's natural affinity for aluminum factories have historically been the worst offenders when it comes to fluoride air pollution. To do this story justice, I'd like to share it with you as much as possible through the eyes of the people who have been affected by it and have been working to correct it for future generations. One of those people is Henry Lickers, the longtime director of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne Department of the Environment. In May 2019, Dr. Lickers was appointed to a 4-year term as a Canadian Commissioner to the International Joint Commission, a body created by the United States and Canada as an independent advisor to the two governments regarding issues of water boundaries. But in the 1970s, Henry Lickers was a recent college graduate from Trent University, where he majored in biology. He had no preconceptions about fluoride being anything but beneficial for health. He tells the story of why he started to change his mind in a talk he gave at the Fluoride Action Network's 4th Citizens Conference on Fluoridation in 2010. Here's Dr. Lickers talking about how he became interested in the negative health effects of fluoride at the FAN conference.
It's interesting to me that coming from a First Nations community or an Indian reserve, that this issue of fluoridation and fluoride would be so important to us. And I went away to New Zealand. In New Zealand, I was working with the Maori people. When I came back, thinking about that area and the different things that they had problems, one of the issues that kept coming up time and time again there was the concepts of natural fluoride. They're a volcanic community, have a lot of volcanoes all over the place. I gather these things spew quite a bit of fluoride. And so they were always concerned about this. And being myself, coming from North America, I thought, wow, American Medical Association, Dental Association, Canadian, everybody. This is wonderful stuff. I can't see what was so important about it. And so never really concentrated on, I was working on wildlife management. Until I came across a little statement, and I think it was by Roger Roholm, and he talked about the first case of fluoride poisoning that he ever found. And that first case was actually found in Java Man. It was an ancient ancestor of the human beings, but lived in a time of great volcanoes and stuff, and was feeding and eating at that time. And you could see the bone tissue in that had been affected. And here was a native person sitting there reading about this going, wow, to see this in such a long time, I got to read some more on this. And so I started reading all of these papers, 1931, 32s, all of those papers in the past, and it fascinated me that here, on one hand, was a huge, enormous amount of effects, and on the other hand, I was being told that this was the most wonderful thing that had ever occurred.
Little did Henry Lickers know that as he was educating himself by reading the extensive literature on the toxicology of fluoride, he was about to accept a job on the other side of the world, working in the Department of the Environment for another indigenous group who had been exposed to hazardous amounts of fluoride air pollution for decades. Dr. Lickers picks up the story on the fan stage.
So I came back to Canada, and I got a job with the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. One of the first jobs that we had was that the cattle on Cornwall Island and the cattle in the community were dying. Instead of living 13 to 14 years, 25 years as a calf-cow operation, they were dying within 3 to 4 years. And the farmers couldn't figure out what was going on. They couldn't understand why. They were taking care of their cattle. The Mohawks, for example, are very good farmers and have farmed for years and years and years and years. And so these were modern people that understood animal husbandry, understood crops and cropping, and how those things were to occur. Suddenly on the South Shore, because of cheap electric power from St. Lawrence Seaway, 2 big aluminum plants go up, Reynolds Metals and Alcoa. And within a very short period of time, the farmers began to notice that their cattle were dying, that things were missing in the environment that should be there, and began to worry about this. In 1976, they established the Department of the Environment, which I was the director of at that time. And we began to do research on those because while we continuously told the non-native people what was happening in our community, nobody seemed to hear. You know, we'd say, well, the bees are no longer on the island. We don't have bees anymore. And everybody go, oh yeah, well, that's probably because you're bad people or something. We don't have rabbits. We don't have quail. We don't have pheasants. We don't have partridge or ruffed grouse. And these were traditional animals that we had and kept. They started to disappear. They were gone. And when I arrived in 1965 or 1975, it was interesting to me because, again, I was used to having buckwheat fields and bees that used them. And suddenly, I could run through a buckwheat field and not get stung. Again, remembering that old history that I had read, I remembered something about bees being affected by this strange compound. And at the same time, George Walbut was talking about this in the Journal of Fluoride, and I found a couple of those. And within a very short period of time, he actually came up and visited Akwesasne, and we sat and talked about the environment that was there. Not just the human environment, but that wild environment that is around us. And so suddenly we saw that, for example, bees are most susceptible to fluoride because they accumulated through a number of different animals. But think of what that does to the environment. No longer do you have that whole group of pollination going on the way it did in the past, and suddenly your crops start to fail. Suddenly the economy of that community is in jeopardy. As we talked about cattle, and began to look for a veterinarian or somebody who could help us with this. Of course, there were lots of people that wanted to help us, but most of them worked for the industry. And of course, they had lots and lots of different papers, but they all told us that fluoride wasn't going to really hurt you too much. And yet we saw our cattle dying. Remember, these were people who really cared for their animals. I was at that time that just on a chance, we got in touch with Dr. Cruz and Malin, and he said, I have to see this. I have to come up and see your, and we were all flabbergasted. Why would this guy travel from Ithaca up to us in Canada and come to see our cattle, having to go through the border and back and forth and all of this stuff? Didn't mind at all. He was really happy to do it. He came up, and I remember him looking at Noah Point's cows and sitting there, and just all he had to do was look at them. And he said, you have a bad case of fluoride.
The veterinarian Lickers is referring to here is Dr. Leonard Kruk, a professor of pathology and associate dean at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell University. Kruk was also the longtime editor-in-chief of the Cornell Veterinarian, a peer-reviewed scientific journal where he published multiple studies from his work at Akwesasne. Prior to the diagnosis from Dr. Kruk, the Canadian government had already become aware of potential fluoride contamination on the island in 1969 when the Ontario Ministry of the Environment began monitoring for fluoride in vegetation and found excessive levels on plants growing in the area. In 1971, the first complaint of fluorosis in cattle was filed by a resident and verified by local officials. A cash settlement was eventually negotiated directly with Reynolds Metals, and a New York state court ordered them to reduce emissions. The company spent $18 million to install pollution control devices and reported a drop in fluoride emissions from 307 pounds per hour to 112 pounds per hour by 1973. The Canadian government and New York health officials assured the Mohawk Nation at Akwesasne that the fluoride emissions that continued to reach their land were well within levels established by scientific studies to be safe. Of course, if you've been following along with the podcast, you know those studies were created on the behalf of corporate polluters to mitigate their vulnerability to lawsuits over fluoride poisoning. Their own legal briefings show they believed their industries would not survive if it became known that chronic exposure to low doses of fluoride is a health hazard. Internal documents reveal they were well aware that they were vulnerable to extensive litigation over fluoride toxicity, not only from the communities they were poisoning, but from their own factory workers who had been showing signs of severe fluoride poisoning for decades. Despite government assurances, the cattle at Akwesasne were still dying. A doctor sent by Reynolds to investigate claimed the cause of the herd's declining health was parasites. That's when the residents at Akwesasne decided to do some independent research and asked Dr. Kruk at Cornell for his assessment. Kruk concludes that all the cattle on the island were suffering from fluoride toxicity and would not live more than 5 years. He determined that the level of fluoride deemed by the National Academy of Sciences to be safe in forage, 40 parts per million, should be reduced to a level as low as 13 parts per million. His report was published in the Cornell Veterinarian in 1979. I'll link to it in the notes. Kruk argued that the fluoride standards set by the National Academy of Sciences were invalid in the field because they were based on studies of fluoride exposure in healthy young animals who were not exposed to fluoride in utero or during the critical first few months of their life when their bones are rapidly developing. They also weren't exposed to fluoride air pollution. In addition, Kruk identified 5 manifestations of dental fluorosis in cattle that were not recognized in what he described as the, quote, limited and superficial classification system for dental fluorosis set by the National Academy of Sciences. I'll link to that paper as well. Here's how Lickers describes the health effects the cows at Akwesasne were experiencing.
Cow operations, the reason that the cows were dying was because of severe and chronic fluorosis in cattle, and the cows couldn't eat. What would happen is their teeth would rot away so bad that the nerve endings would be exposed, and so they would lap water like a cat. In some cases, that was so bad that they would literally walk along on their elbows in the field.
In the video of Lickers' presentation at the FAN conference, the Fluoride Action Network shares some footage of cows suffering from dental and skeletal fluorosis. including footage of a cow walking on its elbows, as Lickers described it. It can be difficult to watch, but I'll include it in the show notes along with his full talk. I was also moved by the touching ways the Mohawk people responded to these chronic illnesses in their cattle.
You think to yourself that a farmer seeing this would say, oh, well, we'll just destroy that animal and get rid of it. But our farmers were so concerned about their animals, that they were their animals, they were responsible for it, that they began to understand different techniques that I found in the literature later. This is what they would do is they harvest grass for the cows and then run over it with a mower 7 or 8 times in order to mulch it so that the cow could eat it easier and wouldn't have to chew the cud so long in order to do this. They found that a good substitute for it was oatmeal, and that they would feed the cows oatmeal. And I say, what other farmer would do this under this type of condition?
The Akwesasne worked with other university researchers as well. In addition to Dr. Crook and his colleagues at Cornell, there was a professor and the founder of the Environmental Studies program at the University of Montana, Dr. Clancy Gordon, who examined thousands of plant samples from Akwesasne and confirmed the many diseased and dying plants were a result of fluoride air pollution. A medical team led by Bertram Karnow, the director of occupational medicine at the University of Illinois, studied the people of Akwesasne to determine how the fluoride air pollution might be impacting their health. One of the methods his team used was to measure the amount of fluoride in the tooth enamel of the island's residents. All of the measurements were elevated above the normal range. They also observed, quote, significant numbers of people with abnormalities of the muscular, skeletal, nervous, and hematologic systems. Local physicians noted high rates of anemia, irritability, rashes, diabetes, high blood pressure, and thyroid disease. Karnow's team concluded that all of the species they considered, from plants to cattle to humans, experienced heavy exposure to fluoride. They called for an immediate reduction in fluoride emissions from the plant and a detailed epidemiological study of the local residents. The aluminum companies did cut their fluoride emissions even further. Reynolds reported a reduction in their fluoride pollution at the plant from 112 pounds per hour in 1973 to 75 pounds per hour by the end of the decade. According to Donald Walters, a senior technical advisor at EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, the Canadian government believed additional reductions in fluoride emissions were warranted, but the U.S. contingent felt the data did not support their conclusion. In 1980, the Canadian Ministry of Health and Welfare launched an official epidemiological study into the possible health effects of fluoride air pollution on the people at Akwesasne. It was led by Irving Selikoff, director of the Environmental Sciences Laboratory at the Mount Sinai School of Medicine in New York. I've not been able to view this report. It's available in the archives at Mount Sinai, but I was told it is restricted, possibly because it contains personal information of the residents. I asked if there was a sanitized version and was told to check PubMed for published studies, but I didn't find much there either. The full report was submitted to the Canadian government in 2 parts in 1984 and 1985, but I couldn't find either one in their archives. There are a few print copies in libraries in Canada, but if anyone has a digital copy of this report or is able to locate it online, please send it my way. I'd love to see it and also include it in the show notes for this episode. Other people who apparently ran into difficulty accessing the results of the study were the people at Akwesasne, many of whom participated in the research itself. Elizabeth Hoover, a professor of American history at Brown University, writes about the Mount Sinai study in her book published in 2017 entitled The River is in Us, Fighting Toxics in a Mohawk Community. After interviewing many of the local people at Akwesasne, she writes that when the researchers finished gathering their evidence, they packed up and left without providing any useful information to the residents. One of the health professionals she spoke with, a woman named Agnes, recalled that the community attempted to go out and look for the information, but the end result was that it was gone. Hoover explains that Selikoff and his team of 40 physicians, dentists, and environmental specialists established an on-site clinic to conduct physical exams, take x-rays, gather blood, urine, and fat samples, and scan for mercury, PCBs, and an insecticide called Mirex. She doesn't describe any of the tests related to fluoride except for blood tests, which did show elevated levels, but apparently were no higher than those seen in people living in communities with artificially fluoridated drinking water. The researchers didn't document any, quote, gross health effects from fluoride exposure, but they did warn that adverse effects could manifest in the next 20 years. Without being able to access the official report from these studies, I'm unable to provide an assessment for how the research team could have missed the obvious negative health effects of fluoride the way we did in last week's episode on the expert panel convened around the same time period in 1983 by the United States Surgeon General to investigate the medical health effects of fluoride in drinking water. But looking at this study from the outside, it's easy to identify a few question marks. First, according to a contemporaneous account written by Donald Walters, the senior technical advisor for EPA's Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, the study by Selikoff was completed in 1982, and EPA was expecting the results by the end of the year, or 1983 at the latest. But the final report was not published until 1985. Why was there such a difference in when he thought the results would be released and the actual date of publication? Maybe there's an innocent reason, but as we saw with the draft report from the expert panel to the Surgeon General, a delay in timing can sometimes indicate that there were extra cooks in the kitchen. In his book, The Fluoride Deception, investigative journalist Christopher Bryson notes that in 1980 and 1981, the years Selikoff was tapped to lead the study in Akwesasne, he and the Mount Sinai School of Medicine received 2 grants totaling nearly $500,000 from the National Institute of Dental Research to study, quote, long-term, low-level exposure to environmental agents in humans. NIDR was literally founded on fluoridation. H. Trenley Dean, the so-called father of fluoridation, was its first director. Did this work or their interaction with researchers at Mount Sinai in any way influence the final report on the effects of fluoride at Akwesasne? Furthermore, the financial stakes for this study were higher than anyone realized, with the exception of perhaps the polluters themselves. Nearly 24 American farmers located near the plant were receiving compensation for their cattle, but the people of Akwesasne didn't want compensation. They wanted to stop the pollution. They can pay us $80 billion, Lickers is quoted as saying, but if we can't live here, what good is it? In 1979, the year before Selikoff launched his study, the tribe filed a class action lawsuit over the fluoride air pollution from Reynolds and Alcoa for $150 million. Now, that's a lot of money, but an even bigger threat was the precedent such a lawsuit could set if successful. As Reynolds' own lawyers argued in the Martin trial discussed in Episode 3, any successful personal injury lawsuit over fluoride air pollution could potentially topple the entire industry and bring down several other heavy fluoride-polluting industries along with it. Selikoff's inability to pin a single negative health effect on fluoride air pollution severely undercut the Mohawk's lawsuit, and the companies ended up paying just $650,000 in damages, a far cry from the $150 million asked for in the claim. Also, as a journalist named Janet Rayloff reported at the time, any documented negative health effects to humans from fluoride would have forced EPA to re-examine their federal regulations on fluoride emissions. Under the Clean Air Act, fluoride was listed as a welfare pollutant, meaning it causes economic damage to crops, etc., but is not a human health hazard. This classification prohibited EPA from setting any enforceable federal regulations based on health effects, and instead they issued guidelines based on the best available technology that proves to be cost-effective for industry, which individual states may or may not decide to follow. Should notable correlations between fluoride exposure and adverse health effects be found in Selikoff's epidemiological study, Rayloff writes, major changes in the way EPA looks at fluoride could result, including its reclassification as hazardous. In the end, fluoride was not reclassified as a health-related form of air pollution, and as EPA's Donald Walters assured industry lawyers in his presentation in 1983, before even receiving the results of the study, EPA did not have any reason to change the federal strategy for controlling fluoride air pollution. Henry Lickers briefly mentions Dr. Selikoff's study in his presentation at the FAN conference, and all he says is that it taught the tribe that the tools of epidemiology sometimes aren't sharp enough to cut down to the community level to see what the impacts are. But for the people who have been living at Akwesasne for generations, the effects of fluoride air pollution are impossible to ignore. In an interview with Elizabeth Hoover, the American history professor from Brown University, one woman from Akwesasne describes her frustration when the prediction from the Mount Sinai study came true and she began to experience the health effects of fluoride toxicity 20 years later. She's part of a cohort of women who suffer from severe arthritis and other ailments they attribute to exposure to pollution. They knew, she said. Mount Sinai said something, so why didn't somebody make a plan and say, this is how you reduce fluoride? Nobody knew it's in every canned food, in water. Who knew that? Nobody knows fluoride is high in grapes and grape jelly. Who knew that? Well, I know it now. And toothpaste, there's alternatives. Nobody knew that. Nobody said. In his presentation at the FAN conference, Henry Lickers explains the impact of fluoride pollution in a way his American audience is likely to understand. He put a U.S. price tag on it, and it starts with a B.
Native people, we know what the impacts are. In our community, when the collapse of the agricultural industry occurred, when the St. Lawrence Seaway no longer moderated the river itself, and our trapping industry collapsed. You see agriculture trapping, and then the fishing industry collapsed because of mercury, myrics, PCBs, and a host of contaminants coming down the river. And suddenly the whole traditional economy of our community was in disrepair and began to collapse. It's interesting to me that Homer Dixon, who began his path at Akwesasne, and talks about the science of scarcity, had a perfect example of how this works for a native community, because we operate much like a nation state. And his comment was, when you have an increasing population, which we do, and a decreasing or degraded environment, what you'll see is a shift in the economic system or economic distribution system within the community. And when that occurs, violence is inevitable. And so what you saw at Akwesasne in 1990 was farmers and people no longer began able to fish, trap, hunt, do those things. The population, however, was still increasing. And you saw the shift of the distribution system from a communal system of barter and trade to an entrepreneurial system that was dependent upon gambling, smuggling, and those type of things. And suddenly the Canadian government and the United States government had to call out their army in order to help police Akwesasne. And I'll say to you one thing, if people ask you, what does this cost you? What does fluoride cost Canada? What does it cost the United States? Realize that in Akwesasne since 1990, Canada and the United States have spent $2.5 billion in policing us. For half of that money, I could clean up the whole St. Lawrence River and we wouldn't have to worry about this. Our people would go back to doing the things that we appreciate. So there's some of the things that I think are important that we consider as we're sitting here. Not just that it gets into the bone and affects people in a certain way. It affects the family, it affects the community, it affects your nation. And at all of those levels, the costs continuously rise exponentially as you go up the highway.
In an interview with activists from Fluoride Free Durham in 2014, Lickers says that price tag has more than doubled since 2011. He also comments on all the new research that suggests prenatal exposure to fluoride leads to a decrease in IQ. We covered the latest study in episode 9 of the podcast. Speaking of the neurotoxic effects of fluoride, Lickers says, quote, "We depend on that 5% of brilliant minds in order to drive society forward and our people forward. It doesn't take too much sense to realize you're putting your communities under real stress." Long after Selikoff's research team came and went, the aluminum factories around Akwesasne continued to spew fluoride air pollution into the surrounding community. In 2013, the Mohawk tribe at Akwesasne, along with the state of New York, reached a settlement with Alcoa and Reynolds Metals for $19.4 million for damages to natural resources and cultural practices due to their release of industrial pollutants into the environment. One of the first things the tribe chose to do with the funds was pay to remove a hydroelectric dam blocking over 500 miles of tributaries flowing from the St. Lawrence River. The dam had been in operation for nearly 100 years, but was recently abandoned when it stopped being profitable. It was the first time a federally licensed dam was decommissioned by a Native American tribe. Now they're working to restock Atlantic salmon smolts in cold water streams within the watershed. The salmon have been missing from the basin for over a century. The Mohawk tribe at Akwesasne posted a time-lapse video of the dam's removal on their YouTube channel. I'll put it in the show notes. It's 3 minutes of pure catharsis following 100 years of unnatural calm. With the rapids restored, the partridges living along the streams at Akwesasne are once again free to drum their wings. If you enjoyed this episode of the Fpollution podcast, please subscribe and leave a review. It really helps other listeners find the show. The Fpollution podcast is a Linda Peterson production. This episode was executive produced by Scott Kuslin, Drew and Helen Jeter, Linda Palmisano, and Christy Lavelle. To find out how you can help us expose the pollution story behind fluoridation by joining the crew at Gallico Studios for as little as $1 a month, or to sign our petition to end fluoridation, visit our website at www.fpollution.com. That's the letter F, then pollution, all one word, .com. Thanks for listening. The information presented in this episode reflects the views and opinions of the hosts and guests invited to appear on the show. It is not intended as medical advice and does not represent the views of the FBI, the U.S. government, or any other individuals or organizations.